So, hello and welcome to Karantena. I'm Nika Mahnic, and today I'm going to have a conversation about digital platforms with Paško Bilic. As my Serbo-Croatian, if I may use this word, is not good enough to talk about digital platforms and digital economy in general. You should excuse our English for today. So the thing is that after coronavirus and the lockdowns, the digital realm became even more important. And to begin the narrative that explains why, let me read some quotes from Nick Saricek's book, Platform Capitalism, just to understand somehow what we're going to talk about. So platforms are digital infrastructures that enable two or more groups to interact. Think Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, and so on. The platform has emerged as a new business model capable of extracting and controlling immense amounts of data. And with this shift, we have seen the rise of large monopolistic firms. As well as far from being mere owners of information, these companies are becoming owners of the infrastructures of society. So we definitely need to talk critically about the digital in our economy and in our everyday lives. So I prepared some questions to Paško. Paško is a research associate from the Institute for Development and International Relations in Zagreb. He holds a PhD in sociology, and he's mostly interested in the critical analysis of social relations that are mediated through digital technologies, public policies, and markets. Some of you might also know him from the 2018 edition of Grounded Festival, where he talked about the power and control of GAFAM, or Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, that are one of the wealthiest companies in the world. So that was 2018, and 2019 came, which was a year of big tech scandals, from Cambridge Analytica to antitrust investigations. And it seems that now it's all forgotten, as Facebook and Microsoft are helping with metagenomic sequencing tools. Amazon is hiring new workers in the US. And Google, which is the recipient of the biggest penalty under GDPR to date, helps authorities track locations with COVID-19 positive individuals. So first question for you, Paško, how are you doing? And how are big tech companies, or perhaps how are digital platforms in general doing in the times of coronavirus?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to do this talk. I'm doing well under the circumstances, coming to you from my balcony to get some fresh air, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so. But this situation, obviously, of physical distancing seems to work well for the majority of big tech companies. Not all of them, of course. You mentioned the quote by Nick Saricek and his book Platform Capitalism. Essentially, what he's talking about is a two-sided model in which platforms act as mediators between different groups of actors, as you stated. This is an old model, actually. It's an old model that was already present in radio and television and traditional media, which had to attract audiences on the one hand and advertisers on the other hand. But in that value chain, there were also different market research agencies that basically provided the data on how many people read newspapers or listened to radio and so on. What we have with digital companies is that you no longer have those research agencies as a part of that value chain. Because everything is centralized. Now, of course, the data becomes the most important resource in that platform business model, and not all tech companies are doing well. If you look at the physical infrastructure and the connections between homeowners and lenders, and platforms like Airbnb that are trying to facilitate connections between travelers and people who are trying to rent their properties, they are having they are struggling a lot in this time period. It's the same with companies such as Uber and Lyft, of course, with many people confined to their private quarters. On the other hand, those that depend on the data, such as Google and Facebook and also Amazon to a large extent that relies on online commerce, as one of the biggest sources of revenue, are doing relatively well. I think that the problem with their involvement in kind of trying to provide some help in this situation is that, first of all, the problem is when health issues become delegated to private companies, which I don't think is a good solution in the long run. And we see how countries such as the UK and the US are struggling the most to handle the crisis, simply because their healthcare systems are in a poor state and they're privatized to a large extent. So delegating those problems, I think, to major companies will not help. Of course, it will help the companies themselves in at least two different ways. It will help them improve the public image, which was very much under attack from many sides due to antitrust and privacy breaches, as you mentioned. I mean, not that they have changed anything in their business model, it's just that more people became aware of negative practices of their business models. And of course, this made politicians more careful in terms of how to react and how to regulate these companies. So on the one hand, they're trying to improve their public image. And on the other hand, you see companies such as Alphabet, the parent company of Google, which has been investing in healthcare for a long time, and they have a company called Verily, which is a small corporate segment, but they've been investing a lot in healthcare in general, for the simple reason because they want to get their hands on a number of patents, which they can then commodify at a later stage. And of course, having access to a large, having access to capital allows them to invest in some areas which are not profitable immediately, but in the long run, they can prove to be profitable. So it's kind of a mixed bag if you talk about big tech companies. Some of them are experiencing losses. Some of them are doing well. Some of them are moving even more towards expanding their data-driven business models towards healthcare. So yeah, I mean, it's a complex response. You also see people like Bill Gates, through his private foundation, basically investing in different companies that will provide vaccines, future vaccines. So there's a lot going on in that area.
Mm-hmm. So many of the companies that we rely on are US based.
Right.
And like also the companies, the GAFAM companies, all of them are coming from the US. What about how important is it still that certain companies are based in a certain country? So do they really bring benefits to those countries? Is this benefit somehow known, or maybe like is there a specific situation also because of how Facebook and how Google are very tied to the US government in some specific ways? So how is this, like, what is the benefit they bring to the state or not?
Right.
So in terms of like, how are we going to lose this battle because we don't have, is it really that the European countries are going to lose, or is it some other like competitive dimension here that we need to think about?
Well, I mean, there are undoubtedly, national US companies. There's a very clear stamp there, to the point that some authors even talk about platform imperialism. And of course, the state is an important factor in promoting imperialism. But their effects in the US are quite different from, for example, General Motors or more traditional companies that produced cars or physical objects. If you look at Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, so the big five, they collectively hired around 1 million workers in 2019. And out of those 1 million workers, I think around 600,000 were hired by Amazon, because they have obviously huge warehouses, and they also bought the Whole Foods company, which was a big kind of health food retailer, in terms of physical stores in the United States and worldwide. So their benefits on the workforce are quite different from those traditional companies when you compare it to companies such as General Motors. They don't hire as many people. They evade a lot of taxes. For example, Donald Trump basically introduced a lower corporate income tax rate, and essentially Apple ended up paying half of their corporate income tax, which would have been paid based on the earlier legislation. So, but nonetheless, Donald Trump sent a thank you note to Apple, which was a very kind of a cynical move for paying corporate income tax, even though he himself reduced the income tax rate. So the effect is quite. There are undoubtedly national companies because they get a lot of regulatory benefits, but they also have a lot of negative effects. Also, for example, Amazon was just a couple of years ago looking for a location for their second corporate headquarters. The first is in Seattle, of course, and they were looking for second headquarters, and there was a huge bidding war between different cities in the United States to host the new headquarters for the tech giant. And I mean, it was a very strange situation in which you had basically public officials bidding and competing against each other on how to attract Amazon to their city, while at the same time the corporate headquarters in Seattle have basically driven the prices of real estate, have influenced a lot on the landscape of the city itself, because Amazon is building a lot of real estate in the city. So it's a very strange situation. I mean, the European companies, of course, the European approach, the regulatory approach in the last 5 years, or even in the last 20 or 30 years, if you look at the approach towards regulating the media industry or the cultural industry, was always kind of a defensive approach of defending the European single market against the US influence. But in terms of kind of building European companies that can compete in an economic sense in terms of scale and scope to the US companies, I think that's something that the European countries will have a lot of difficulty in reaching. You do have smaller examples. I don't know about Slovenia, but in Croatia, especially now in this situation, there are two European companies, Volt and Glovo, that are doing relatively well now in terms of food delivery and delivering groceries. But in terms of scale, I don't think that they can compete with American companies, simply because they have a different institutional setup. And for example, financial capital and venture capital is one of the big reasons for the global growth of American companies, and especially the regulatory antitrust approach, which basically awards growth, it awards scale, and it awards vertical integration, which is something that the European regulation and the European markets are still not ready to do, which I think is a good thing ultimately.
Mm-hmm. So the issue is access to capital in a way. Like also if you think about Croatia, that there is not enough like the angel investors and like venture capitalists that would.
Absolutely. I think if you look at Amazon, if you look at the growth of Amazon, Amazon has been operating with losses for years, but that didn't prevent investors from investing in the company. And actually, I mean, the company is doing remarkably well in terms of their market capitalization in the U.S. financial markets. So the U.S. approach is to foster growth over revenue, or growth over profits. So Amazon, I think in 2018, they recorded a 4% profit of their revenue, which was a record for the company. Other companies such as Google and Facebook record a much higher profit rates compared to Amazon. You have also Uber that is, I think, still operating with losses. But nonetheless, I mean, they did their IPO, I think that was last year, or was it in 2018? So it was relatively recent, if I'm not mistaken. But they still managed to attract a lot of financial capital, and that's one of the strategies of the U.S. system. And I think even Bill Gates wrote a little bit about it, and it's a concept called blitzscaling, which means get big as soon as possible and as quickly as possible, and think about profits afterwards. And so the system seems to be working right now for the US companies.
Mm-hmm. So Amazon is like the biggest e-commerce platform in a way. Right. Also, like one of the things that happened after the 2003 SARS outbreak was a huge rise in e-commerce platforms in China. And also we see here in Slovenia now, like many people are using the delivery for their groceries. People wait in line in order to get their groceries and so on. And also this something might change as well in terms of like contactless payments, etc. And now at the time in the time of the great lockdown in India, the government also categorized e-payments and e-commerce as an essential service, which includes delivery, like food delivery and groceries delivery. So something is shifting again. Do you have any other information? What is shifting now? Have you heard about any other stories related to e-commerce at the moment, or like is it just like the usual business of like we cannot do business as usual, so we're just going online, or is it something else behind this new dynamic?
Well, I think obviously it's going to help Amazon, reach an even higher concentration in the market. They do rely to a large extent on the U.S. market. I think half of their revenue comes from the U.S. market, so they don't, or even more. I think even 2/3. I'm not sure on the exact number. Simply because it's easier to make the deliveries within the confines of the United States, right? In terms of how this will influence e-commerce, we see a lot of local, for example, fruit and vegetable producers trying to make deliveries, but they're simply overwhelmed with demand. So a lot of them have even in Croatia closed down the deliveries because they simply can't, or sorry, not the deliveries, but the online orders for 2 weeks, because they need more time to process all of the orders. So it's also a question of how do you manage a sudden surge in demand? And obviously these big companies are better positioned to handle these surges in demand. You see it in e-commerce. Obviously you see it also in services such as Netflix and YouTube that are having that had to scale down. For example, Netflix had to scale down the video quality of their services to make sure that, you know, in times of high demand they can still deliver their service to people. So I'm expecting a huge surge, obviously, in e-commerce and delivery platforms. But how this will be handled by smaller companies, I'm not sure. I hope that they will be able to survive, and that the local food delivery companies and small businesses will manage to do this, because I think even after we manage to reduce the number of new infections, this prolonged state of physical isolation will certainly influence the habits that people have in terms of, you know, doing groceries and buying stuff on the internet. So,
I mean, also Amazon decided not to offer the third-party vendors the ability to sell non-essential services. So, which
right.
is like it really influenced many smaller businesses. They had to close basically because their main source of attracting customers is the Amazon platform. And this already caused like many businesses to close, and Amazon really has this hold on this market. So it's maybe a specific kind of platform that can allow itself to set the rules of the market. That's maybe like, it's really important to look at it in a different perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean that has been their business models from the start, and that's one of the reasons why they favored growth over profit, right? Because they attract a lot of revenue, but the company was until relatively recently operating with low profitability or even with losses, and of course they did it first with the book industry, simply because a lot of the bookstores were closed because Amazon was driving the prices down, and they were unable to compete. So yeah, I mean it's a part of their long-term strategy, and it's been a part of their long-term strategy, and now they're just taking advantage in another area as well of their size.
So I found a quote from MIT Technology Review, which interestingly for this publication, we can sense a colonial undertone. And it says, from a data production perspective, activities are like lands waiting to be discovered. Whoever gets there first and holds them gets their resources. In this case, their data riches. And with this intro, I would like to ask you something about Zoom, which interestingly, we tried our best to record this conversation elsewhere, but when we started the recording on Jitsi, it said all recorders are currently busy. So we decided to try something else, and I think Zoom is like in the news, not in the well, in the news as well, but also not only used by privates or like by private use, by personal home use, but I mean home use is also business use at the moment. But in Slovenia, it was recommended to be used in higher educational institutions, and then on the 2nd of April, which was more than 2 weeks after the remote educational activities started, the Slovenian Information Security Administration, or Urad za informacijsko varnost, warned of its safety on their website and on Twitter, their Twitter account. So I'd like to ask you, what's the deal with Zoom? Well, what is the issue with Zoom, and maybe what is the deal with Zoom? And how was the digitization of academic work handled in Croatia, if it was any different than in Slovenia?
Well, I don't know much about the situation around the specificities around Zoom. In Croatia, we had at least no official warnings of the privacy settings and privacy issues with Zoom. Obviously, everything turned now to the, with the schools being closed, everything turned down to virtual classes. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Zoom was also recommended and is widely used for educational and academic purposes. I think the bigger problem with, especially with educational uses of different technologies, even besides privacy concerns, I think is the fact that they reinforce existing social inequalities. So, I mean, it's not easy for everybody and for all the parents to simply to switch to the online system at home. I think our country is, I can speak about Croatia. Croatia still has a relatively low internet penetration rate, which is around between 75 and 80% of internet penetration in the country. It still ranks low in terms of the Digital Economy and Society Index, which is handled by the European Commission. So I think just switching it to the online realm creates a lot of difficulties in terms of access and in terms of skills in the general population that are necessary to to maintain the level of education that is needed for kids, for elementary and high school kids. So I can't really give you much details on Zoom. As I said, there were no warnings and there was no concern, at least in the media, when it comes to these privacy issues that you mentioned earlier. So,
I mean, all the issues that were mentioned, like the access also that they send data to Facebook, even if you don't have a
right,
Facebook
right,
account, then the
right,
question of getting access to your camera and microphone,
right,
which you
yeah,
don't know where the access starts and where the access finishes. But then they said they patched the issues, which you again, like if you don't look at the
yeah,
code, it's not an open source application, so you cannot really check what's happening there. So I don't know what is happening now, because like they said that, yeah, there are no issues anymore. We know that we didn't do well, blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting, like as a phenomenon, how fast the quote coming from Silicon Valley, move fast
right,
and break things, really
right,
got into our in
right,
our organisms, in the way how we go further with the digital. Like it's not that the digital started yesterday. It's just like it was so sudden, the shift to our lives being overly, in a way, digitized, that perhaps the responsible use of tech came to the second position. It was not so important that it perhaps should. And then you find it very interesting that even the educational institutions that were supposed to be the ones informed of perhaps not so privacy breaches, the issues with the security of data, they just uncritically proposed the usage of a certain tool without thinking about the consequences of it. And this really shows, I guess, also that the value of data, which is something very abstract, if you don't really work in the industry and don't know how the data is used for predictions and for fueling AI, like people still think that, not people, but like many still think that artificial intelligence is, we don't know what, like robots and something like things for science fiction. But artificial intelligence uses the data that we provide when we are on Zoom, when we are on all those platforms that are now replacing our face-to-face contacts, well, interaction, I would say. So I mean, I think this is just like, I just wanted to point this out in a way of like, we don't know who Zoom sells the data to,
exactly,
and what is this data being used for. But probably it's very useful for ad tech companies, or like for
right,
companies that want to enter the space in which they can profit from the data about people's educational patterns. So we're gonna see what happens with Zoom. But I found this information that Zoom's shares in Zoom were up 74% this year, and the S&P 500 was down 20%, but still shares in Zoom were up 74%.
right,
I don't think
right.
I'm like good in like explaining exactly how this dynamic works, but still. But also wanted to ask you, as you come from Zagreb, I mean, as you live in Zagreb, um, did the recent earthquake cause also any disruption to digital services or the digital infrastructure, or perhaps like the stability of internet? I mean, I know that it's bizarre to ask this among all the other questions that I could ask about the earthquake in Zagreb. But I also wonder this specific question because I have no idea about it. Like, is the digital, like, was there no effects on the digital infrastructure? Was the effects only on the other infrastructures, or how do you experience this?
Well, the digital we experienced no shortage in supply of digital services. We had a very brief, at least in my neighborhood, a very brief kind of power outage, like immediately after the earthquake, but power came back after like 30 minutes or even less. I mean, the city was damaged in terms of the physical infrastructure in the city center. So mostly like 19th century buildings were damaged. And actually, the institute where I work is situated in a building that was built in 1905, and now it's temporarily closed. So we will be forced to work from home for an extended period of time. So mostly the damage occurred in buildings that were built before 1963 or 1961, 63, I think, which was the time of the earthquake in Skopje in Macedonia. And I think it was a 6 point something earthquake. So after the earthquake, which destroyed a lot of the city, there were new rules for new construction rules and construction regulations. So all of the buildings, or the vast majority of the buildings that were built after 1963 were completely went completely without any damage. In terms of the digital infrastructure, I didn't experience anything myself personally, and I don't think that anything like that happened in Zagreb at all. So so I think in that regard we ended up unscathed. So so that was one of the things that was undamaged in the earthquake. But to tell you the truth, I mean, on a personal note, it was a very strange feeling being woken up at 6:20 in the morning and you know, not knowing what to do, because you had contradictory instructions. You know, when there's an earthquake, you're supposed to go outside, but because of the virus, you're supposed to stay inside. So it was this really strange. Sorry, it was this really strange situation for a moment. But now it's past. So everything's back to the normal state of the pandemic, and relying on digital services, which is the topic of our discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I also woke up in Ljubljana from this earthquake, so I mean, I cannot imagine how strong it was in Zagreb. So maybe the last question. I know that there's a lot of talk about whether we should ask philosophers for recommendations, or like about how to live and stuff like that. I'm not sure if you consider yourself a philosopher. I guess you are a thinker, so I think that might be good enough. And do you have any like recommendations of how to live digitally, or like perhaps like what to keep in mind while reflecting on the digital platforms, on reflecting on platforms in general?
Well, I think that's a great question, actually. So I guess I would qualify as a thinker or a philosopher. We actually started something within the Croatian Sociological Association, which is called Sociology from Isolation. And one of the first we tried to write these kind of popular scientific pieces based on our different areas of expertise, and sociology is obviously a very broad field in itself. And one of the points that we try to emphasize is try to stay physically isolated, not socially isolated. Because I mean, the recommendations are somehow from the epidemiologists, from the healthcare specialists, doctors. The recommendation is to maintain a social distance, which I think is a wrong term. It should be termed maintain a physical distance, because that's the problem. And obviously the digital infrastructures help us to maintain some sense of social proximity. So, you know, maintain physical distance, you know, don't create social distance. That's one of the messages that we try to propagate through the Sociological Association in Croatia. So I guess it's a broad message, and digital infrastructures certainly help, but of course we shouldn't forget about the inherent dangers that are present, especially when there are only a few services or a few companies that offer certain digital services. So I think it's great that we had this conversation about the topic. So
okay, well, thank you very much. Hope to see you soon in Ljubljana. We hope that the quarantine ends sooner or later. No, hopefully not later, hopefully sooner. And thank you very much for this conversation.
thank you.